welcome to the firm. On the show this week, it's transfer pricing magic, recharacterizing equity into debt, and why the US FTC says Google is not guilty of search bias. Our top story this week, there's a sudden furore over recent transfer pricing orders that have recharacterized equity issuances by private companies, Indian companies that is, to foreign parents as debt. Case in point, the Shell story, which made newspaper headlines this week. Now, reports say that shares issued by Shell to its foreign parent were valued by the company at 10 rupees a share, whereas revenue priced them at 180 rupees a share. Revenue treated the difference in value as a loan from the Indian company to the parent, a 15,000 crore rupee loan on which interest is payable and hence taxable. Now, Shell is just one of at least a dozen companies that are facing similar transfer pricing orders, all in the course of this week. Joining me to talk about this new TP magic that changes equity into debt are PwC's Bipin Pawar and EY's Vijay Iyer. Vijay, Bipin, thank you very much for joining me. Bipin, let's start with you first in simple English and in 30 seconds? Can you describe to me what the problem here is?
Okay, let's take an example. There's an Indian company which issues shares at, say, rupees 100.
Right.
Now, we are talking about financial year 08-09, at which time the DCF valuation guidelines were not in existence.
Right. CCI was in existence
because
at that time.
They were issued sometime in April 2010.
Right.
Right. At that time, most companies would have priced the shares based on CCI guidelines.
Correct.
CCI guidelines established the floor price. So they could have very well issued those shares at a price above the CCI guidelines. So in such cases, what is happening is the tax department would revalue the shares.
Okay.
Perhaps by applying the DCF valuation method.
Right.
And in the example that I gave you, let's say they come up with a value of 450. The difference of 350, they say that that's the value of the benefit that the Indian company has attempted to pass to the parent.
Right.
And therefore they say that that's a deemed loan on which the Indian company needs to get interest.
And hence that interest would be taxable.
That's
now,
right.
how can the tax department apply DCF if CCI was the prevailing pricing guideline at that time?
I think before we get into what they could apply, the more fundamental question is that if you have issued shares to a non-resident, that's really not a transaction which results in taxable income to begin with.
Okay.
Okay. It's a transaction that is covered by transfer pricing, yes. But it's not a transaction that results in taxable income. And if there is no taxable income that is created, where is the question of recharacterizing or repricing that transaction? So that's the first.
So that's the first weakness in the revenues argument.
So that's the first thing.
Okay.
If you move ahead from that and then say that, okay, this is not actually equity, but it's in the form of a deemed loan, then what you're essentially trying to do is that you are recharacterizing equity into debt.
Yeah, and therefore creating some sort of income, right?
Yeah.
As interest.
So the second point around that is that under the transfer pricing code as it stands today, there are really no provisions which allow the department to recharacterize.
Okay.
Okay. So
you made the point when we were talking on the phone that GAR allows you to do that, but GAR is not in force as yet.
Absolutely.
And even GAR comes within its own circumstances and
Absolutely.
parameters.
Yeah.
All right. So that's the second weakness in their
That's the
argument.
second weakness.
Okay. And then how could they apply DCF when CCI was the prevailing?
See, if they have to impute an adjustment, they have to value the shares in some form.
Right.
And I think the way they are perhaps going about this is that DCF was issued in April 2010.
Right.
So there is a reference point available.
All right. Vijay, in our conversations, you were pointing out that while the media may have discovered this in the last 48 hours, simply because a bunch of transfer pricing orders came in over the course of Thursday and Friday, this has been a problem that has existed maybe in a slightly different form for almost 2 years now, right?
That's right. So we've seen this in the context of Indian companies having foreign subsidiaries, where the same recharacterization issues have arisen, where they say that if there is a premium when you allot shares as a foreign subsidiary to an Indian parent, that premium is a form of a loan, again recharacterized into a loan, and interest to be charged by the Indian company to the foreign subsidiary. So we've seen this in the context of certain Indian headquartered companies in the last year, and that has gone through DRP, reached the tribunal now, and we'll hear the outcome of that in a few years. But
would you fault the revenues argument on the same grounds that Bipin has?
Yeah, sure. And as a person who would subscribe to shares of a company, I would say that if I have not paid a particular call money there is no interest that arises there. And if a company doesn't want to raise the call money and says it's a partly paid share, even to the extent of 10%, and 90% of the call money is yet to be got from the shareholder, it doesn't become a loan. So I fail to understand the whole logic of this adjustment, and I would hope the tribunal will also look at it in the same context.
All right, you'll make it sound like a fairly easy win, but that can't be the case, because if Revenue thought it had an absolute no case going here, it would not have resorted to what it has. And I think some people have estimated the adjustments to be made as fairly large over the last 48 hours, the orders that have brought about. So how do you expect this to progress? What do you think will be the arguments that Revenue makes where that had for me?
I think where all this is coming from, and the fact is that some of these orders are still coming out, and many of these orders have not really reached the taxpayers, so one needs to wait and see what they actually write in those orders.
Right.
But I think where this is all stemming from is that there was an amendment in the 2012 budget,
which expanded the definition of international transactions.
That's right, and they included the word capital financing in there.
Right.
And I would believe that the Revenue will be wanting to take shelter under that. And my reaction to that is that the word financing inherently means debt, and even if the word capital financing itself has not been defined in the statute, it has to take the color from its neighbors. And if you see the
but
neighbors,
I seem to understand from some of the stuff that I read regarding the Finance Bill 2012 that capital financing also includes the purchase or sale of marketable securities of any type of advance or any type of advance.
See, when you issue shares, there is no sale to begin with. If you look
Aren't you splitting hairs?
If you interpret the word financing in conjunction with its neighbors, you have things like financial guarantees, you have things like loans and advances.
You also have spelled out the purchase or sale of marketable securities.
It could be debt securities.
It could be equity, which is exactly the case here. Vijay, what do you make of whether Revenue has a case or not?
Purchase and sale I can understand. So subscription is a totally different transaction. We've seen transactions of purchase and sale of equity shares being subject to transfer pricing, and none of us will disagree that it is a transaction where capital gains are involved. There is an element of tax involved. You have to do the valuation. But when it comes to subscription share, that transaction itself is not subject to any transfer pricing. And as I said, even if I have underpaid, the differential is only a call money that the company has to.
So you're treating it as a partly paid share.
Yeah, I don't see any other way of looking at it. It cannot be said that if the company wanted 100 rupees of share capital in its company, it should have actually gotten 5,000 rupees as share capital, because it would have issued the same number of shares but at a higher value. The way we look at
But Vijay, you will concede, without taking names of companies or referring to any specific examples, you will concede that there has been a trend of several Indian subsidiaries underpricing the shares that they issue to their foreign parents, which is why we have this plethora of pricing guideline rules in place, whether they're in place by the RBI or otherwise. So maybe the Revenue does have a case in some of these orders at least, where they have actually found serious underpricing.
No, if it's a rights issue, if it's the same shareholder who already has 100% equity in the subsidiary, he puts in more money. At least all of the clients that I have met, no one is interested in the valuation of that share. They say it's a neutral issue. If you tell me that I should subscribe to one share worth 1,000 rupees or 100 shares of 10 rupees, it's the same issue for me. So the issue of subscribing at a lower price arises when there's a different shareholder coming in.
That's right.
Are you trying to exit the business by bringing in a new shareholder at a lower price and thereby transferring the business to him?
So do these recent transfer pricing orders not make that distinction between an existing shareholder and a new shareholder coming in, or a 100% subsidiary and a subsidiary that is seeking other shareholding?
It doesn't distinguish, and most of the issues that we are dealing with are companies who have had significant shareholding in the Indian company, so they were quite neutral to the valuation. It was a compliance they needed to go through. They did that and did the valuation in a best estimate possible. And I have seen companies actually trying to say that, I would like to bring it at premium because it reduces my stamp duty on the transaction. Can I do that? And a lot of pushback is to say that no, it's a bit unfair to try and plan your capital duty by trying to have an overpriced premium. So Here what is happening is that the tax office coming back and saying that you should have actually multiplied your share premium significantly and thereby reduce the share capital issue, in which case you would have had a lesser stamp duty to pay.
All right, okay.
So it's a different structure altogether.
Okay, so I get the arguments against what revenue is trying to do. How big is this problem really, and what are you advising clients to do, not just in the case of those who have to defend themselves against such orders, but those that are probably undertaking such transactions from here on? How do they fall safe and not foul of transfer pricing
For
authorities?
clients who are undertaking this transaction today, in any case, the valuation norms require them to price at least at DCF.
Right, so that's taken care of.
So that's to some
Though
extent.
in DCF it says as well you can arrive at different values.
You can have a situation where the tax department can still poke holes into the DCF and still arrive at some premium.
All right, Vijay, last word to you.
The magnitude of these issues are pretty big because these are high stakes, big transactions, and therefore a lot of companies will have significant adjustments as a result of this. But I still think that some of the reports on the numbers that have been quoted are slightly mistaken, because they are probably looking at the differential between the valuation itself, which is the deemed loan number itself, and not the interest on that. So that's a bit overstated. That's one part. The other is on litigation and trying to find a resolution to this. 90% of the battle is going to be conceptual. To say that this is not a transaction, there is always a valuation methodology prescribed, and it's virtually tax neutral for the taxpayer. And once it gets to the quantification issue, it is going to be a challenge, because there is always going to be an opinion about the present value of future cash flows and what are those cash flows.
So you're saying that this problem will persist?
Yes, unfortunately, the way the Indian litigation system works, until the Supreme Court says that this is not a transaction, we'll have transfer pricing officers looking at this across the country.
All right, gentlemen, I'm going to have to leave it there, but thank you very much, Vijay and Bipin, for adding one more item to P. Chidambaram's very long list of tax issues that he needs to resolve in this budget. With that, we're going to take a quick break, but coming up on the other side, why the US FTC says Google is not guilty of search bias.